And also just next door. She has worked a lot on the domain of corpus linguistics, structural grammar, so empirical research overall, and also word Englishes, which is the topic of today. So English as a first language, a second language, etc. So today she will be giving us a talk on planning, safeguarding, and using linguistic diversity. That's I had Corpora constructions. Yeah, but so indeed, so a talk that is in a domain that I mentioned before, namely corporal constructions and new Englishes, a cognitive construction grammar approach to the varieties of English, which is completely in the topic of sociolinguistics. That is the topic of that.
Thank you very much for that kind of introduction. As someone who has specialized in English linguistics, I always feel a bit wary talking about safeguarding linguistic diversity, because that to me evokes preserving endangered languages, minority languages, and that doesn't sit very well with the role of English, its hegemony around the world, and it being a little bit of a killer language. But the point that I'm taking here, the stance I'm taking here, is that linguistic diversity is also about intralinguistic variation. And so in that respect, the colonial legacy of Britain gives us a test bed to learn a lot about how linguistic variation works. And so here in this talk, it's really a talk that lies at the crossroads of my three main areas of expertise: corpus linguistics, construction grammar, and varieties of English. And we'll be looking a little bit more into a cognitive construction grammar approach to varieties of English. And so here, the goals of this talk are threefold. First of all, I would like to define and profile what exactly new Englishes are, what are their features, and also, in that respect, trace the paradigmatic shift that took place for their recognition as varieties in their own right. The second goal, which is in line with the notion of having data to investigate variation, I would like to showcase two flagship corpora in the field that have enabled an empirical approach to linguistic variation in new Englishes. And then the third goal is to show, how these corpora have been used and exploited to gain insights into the interplay between, on the one hand, social factors and forces, and on the other hand, more cognitive forces in the shaping of these varieties. So first things first, when one thinks of varieties of English, probably the first ones that may come to mind would be first language varieties like American English, British English, potentially Australian English, and the like. But there are also many post-colonial Englishes, Indian English, Ghanaian English, Hong Kong English, and the like. And these post-colonial Englishes are also referred to as new Englishes. And to profile what characterizes them, I would like to draw on a model, a seminal model in the field introduced by Thatcher in '85, which is the three concentric circle model. And it's a model that distinguishes between, in the middle, the inner circles that refers to English as a native language countries, typical examples being Britain or the US. The outer circle, where English is typically a second language, also referred to as new Englishes here. That would be examples like India, Singapore, and the like. And then a third circle, which is the expanding circle, where we may wonder, are these actually varieties of English? And so countries where English is a foreign language, like France, Japan, Brazil would also fit in this category. Now, in spite of its apparent simplicity, this is a model that actually accounts for differences between these three varietal types on a number of dimensions. On the spread of English, the status of English, the functions of English, the acquisitional setting, and the norm orientation of the speakers. And so I will relatively briefly go through each of them to show what exactly characterizes new Englishes, so English as second language varieties compared to the other two kinds. So here now you'll see each time using this table, I won't be talking about American, Indian, or German English in particular, but these are each time examples of each, so that you have a bit in mind what would be an example of each type. So in terms of the spread of English, here we're taking a historical perspective, and most inner circle and outer circle varieties are varieties that result from colonization, which is of course not at all the case in the expanding circle. But between the inner and outer circle, there's a difference in the kind of colonization. So the inner circle, they're varieties that emerged from colonies of settlement. So meaning you had large migration movements and speakers who formed a new speech community in the location, whereas in the outer circle, they emerged from colonies of exploitation. So meaning that there you had very few migrants, typically administrators, educators, who introduced the language in a local population, right? Which also then creates a strong contact situation. In terms of the status of English, in the inner circle, English is typically at least the de facto official language and also the mostly only language to have that status. In the outer circle, English is almost always an official or at least semi-official language, so it has some institutionalized status, but also typically alongside other languages. Whereas in the outer circle, English does not have any institutional status. It is recognized as important for international purposes, but that is about it. Then regarding the functions of English, this is where it gets really interesting. So in the inner and the outer circle, English is an intra-national language. So meaning that it is used between speakers of the country. So within a speech community of English, right, of the language. That is, of course, not at all the case in the expanding circle, where English is a foreign language. There, it is used potentially internationally, but you don't have a specific speech community in the country as such. And there are differences, however, regarding the extent to which English is used in the inner and outer circle. So in English as a native language countries, it's clearly very much used in the public sphere. So by that, I mean the media, the administration, education, as well as in the private sphere, right? Dominant language there. In the outer circle, we'll see later that there is a bit of variation, but let's say that the generalization would be that it typically has a role in the public sphere. So in the media, administration, or education, but very rarely used in the private sphere. So you have a bit of an in-between status, whereas in the expanding circle, clearly not used in the private sphere and a very limited role in the public sphere. What does that mean in terms of acquisition of English and the acquisitional setting? Well, English is a first language in the inner circle, a second language in the outer circle, and a foreign language in the expanding circle. So in an ENL setting, that means that English is acquired at home, in class, and society. In a new English setting, here we have a bit of a dual acquisitional setting, in the sense that English is, for instance, going to be a medium of instruction in the education system, but also a subject. So you have that kind of dual status, and speakers also have some degree of exposure in society, in everyday life. Whereas in the expanding circle, I mean, it's typically mostly a subject taught in class. And sure, nowadays, we tend to have a bit more exposure through, I don't know, movie series, the internet and the like, that remains somewhat limited. Okay, then turning to the last dimension, that's the one of norm orientation. And so this refers to what is the norm standard of English that speakers, tend to refer to. And so here, on the first level, the inner and outer circle varieties are said to be endonormative. So they turn to their own standard, their own norms of English, whereas in the expanding circle, where English is a foreign language, clearly they are exonormative. They tend to refer most often to the British or American norm as being the right standard, let's say. There are, of course, a bit differences between the inner and outer circle there. So the inner circle is also said to be norm providing, whereas in New Englishes, they're said to be norm developing. The degree of stability of standards is also not necessarily as stable or established. And this also comes importantly with the question of identity. In the inner circle, English is a strong identity carrier. In the outer circle, to some extent too, there is really this notion that English no longer belongs to the colonizer, right? There's this appropriation of English, and English is also an identity carrier. We'll see later that there's a bit of variation there possible, whereas in the expanding circle, it's purely functional. All right. Now, why was this three-circle model proposed, and why is it so seminal? It actually grew out of an ideological concern to distinguish English as a second language varieties from English as a foreign language varieties. And there's a big debate that took place between Sir Randall Burke, that you see there on the left, and Cashrew in the 1990s, 91 time frame. And at the time, it was really not at all obvious that these should be considered as varieties in their own right. So Quirk defended the view that, well, actually, these New Englishes, they're a manifestation of the failure to acquire real English. His view was there was no real difference between English as second language or foreign language. It's a deficient form of English. And he thought that, it would be encouraging lower standards to say that they were varieties in their own rights, and that would be a setback, a social setback for speakers, basically. Cashrew went like, okay, boomer, and actually said, well, you're missing the point here, because New Englishes are really very much rooted in a very specific social cultural context. Importantly, with the role of having international purposes with identity values, and that they're definitely not inferior or deficient in any way, but should be recognized as varieties in their own right. And of course, this is now the accepted view, right? But up until the 90s, that was not necessarily obvious. And so, right, so as I was saying, there was really very much an ideological concern on Cashrew's point and his model to really establish New Englishes as being varieties in their own right. And here, one, say, theoretical notion that goes with this is that of nativization. So the point being that New Englishes result from the process of nativization, meaning that they are an adaptation to new sociocultural contexts used by members of another speech community. And linguistically, what that means is that this comes with systematic changes in the linguistic system at all linguistic levels. So basically, this means that, well, of course, they are, as a result, these new sociocultural contexts develop new linguistic conventions. And there was an interest in, of course, or has been and still is an interest in identifying those new linguistic conventions. Here are a couple of examples. It can be at the level of lexis with coinages or borrowings. So something like futuresse, for instance, to refer to female teacher, or borrowings like Rojac to refer to specific kind of food. At the level of phonology, where the th fricatives have been replaced by s or z, t or d. At the level of grammar, where the progressive tense has been shown to be used with stative verbs, for instance, as she's knowing her science very well. And now these are examples of, say, the features that were initially identified. So early characterizations of New Englishes, somewhat prior to corpus data. And note, these are features, conventions that are relatively conspicuous, right? They're quite noticeable. They're categorical in nature more than they are quantitative in nature. And so this is where I go over to introducing corpora and what then they have brought to characterizing nativization, and so the emergence of new linguistic conventions in new Englishes. And so in the 1990s, the first major effort in having corpus data was a project called the International Corpus of English, initiated by Greenbaum. And then there's a second corpus that is a bit more recent, which is the GLOBE corpus, which refers to the global web-based English corpus. So I'll start by saying a few words about each, right? What are they made up of? So the International Corpus of English is a set of subcorpora that contains both varieties of English as a native language and as a second language, so new Englishes. It's a little bit old. It contains data from the 90s. And each corpus is made up of roughly 1 million words per variety. So 40% of writing and 60% of speech. By today's standards, those are relatively small corpora, well, 1 million words. But they have the massive advantage that they have a highly controlled design. Meaning by that they are made up of a range of different genres. So private conversations, university lectures, creative writing, academic writing, newspaper language, and it's the exact same design for each component. Importantly too, and that's also something that has to do with the controlled design, they are all representative of the standard variety of the variety in question, so the acrolet of the variety. What that means is that the way that they selected contributors to the corpus is that they had to be over 18, spent all or really most of their life in the country in question, and had their higher education, or all their education, sorry, in English. And yeah, the advantage then is that we have highly comparable data across all varieties. Now, a bit later, in 2013, came the corpus of global web-based English. Here too, we have data from ENL and New English's varieties. Here, data from the 2010s. In terms of size, we're dealing with something completely different. They contain between 20 and 350 million words per variety. That's really huge. But this has basically been web crawled, right? It's mostly based on the website domain as a way to identify what comes from one country or another. So it's not particularly controlled. We don't have a good idea of who has produced what kind of text, if there has been some editing, potentially by native speakers. So there's a bit of, it's more of a mixed bag, let's say. In terms of genres, what do we have here? So it's a web-based corpus, is 60% of blog content, and then 40% of other web content, newspaper, magazine language, or text from company websites. But here too, you can say that these are relatively comparable in terms of what they contain across varieties. Okay, so what has Corpora then brought to the study of new Englishes? They have a range of advantages. They make it possible to have a very systematic approach in identifying novel features and conventions. So consider to what extent they are widespread or not within a variety. Potentially also across varieties. Are features potentially shared across varieties? What is variety specific versus what is shared? And then the second aspect is, of course, Corpora typically are about taking a quantitative approach to language. And so, sure, some features are categorical in nature, like new words, say new prepositional verbs, like discuss about, for instance, being a widely discussed example. But as has been argued and showed, many features are actually more probabilistic in nature. So a lot has to do with differences in, say, preferences for certain structures over others, or differences in productivity. And that's really something for which you need large databases to be able to capture that kind of variation. So yeah, there would be different preferences for certain constructions, lexical differences, for instance, in alternations, and the like. Now, more recently too, and I'm highlighting this a little bit because this is what I will be focusing on next, there have also been means, a way to test and refine theoretical models about nativization in new Englishes. So there have been several models that have, tried to explain a little bit how, what context, what leads to nativization and the development of new Englishes. And in order to discuss that, the first thing that I would perhaps need to add to what I have introduced before is that when we talk about new Englishes, it's not like every context is the same in every single variety of country, right? So there is diversity, let's say, within the unity. This is, these are the features that I introduced earlier on, and this may have initially given the impression that we're dealing with a homogeneous situation across all as ESL New Englishes context, but actually the social cultural realities differ, sometimes pretty vastly. So, for instance, the social cultural situation in Hong Kong, India, or Singapore are not the same. Okay, and so clearly there is some degree of diversity, and it has quite a bit to do with how, the degree of social penetration of English within the New Englishes countries. And that is going to affect, well, and these are things that go together, the functions that English may have in a particular context. So it can have pretty limited range of functions or a wider range of functions in the public or private sphere. As a result, and that goes a bit hand in hand, how much English is an identity carrier is also going to vary. And typically, the more you use English, the stronger an identity carrier it is, right? And again, as something that goes hand in hand with that, same thing for the norm orientation. The stronger your identity is connected to your use of the language, the more you are going to refer to your own norm versus referring to external norm. And there is one model that's also really a seminal and the other really seminal model in the field, which is called the dynamic model of the evolution of post-colonial Englishes. And this is a model that was introduced by Schneider. It's a relatively complex model, but if I simplify things a little bit, it's a model that traces the development, typically historical, of post-colonial Englishes in 5 different stages. And the cornerstone, say, notion that is central to the different say stages in the model is that of identity formation. So the identity formation across a number of stages. And this identity formation is used as a starting point to make predictions about the norm orientation of the speakers and the resulting degree of nativization. So basically the linguistic behavior of the speakers. So here I have represented a continuum with the 5 different stages here on the left. I won't go through each of the different stages. I'll just explain the general trend, right, that this model say argues for. What it basically says is that, well, the more advanced a variety is in the model, well, the more functions English has in the country, therefore, the more identity marking it is, and therefore, the more endonormative the speakers will be. Okay? By contrast, it is less advanced, it has fewer functions, it's less identity marking, and it's less endonormative. In terms of predictions regarding linguistic behavior, the idea is that, well, if a variety is more endonormative, it refers more to its own standards, and so we're going to find more new linguistic conventions. Okay, and therefore also distinguish oneself more from the typically most often British norm. That, of course, the reverse would be true for the least advanced varieties. Just to now exemplify this a little bit more, because this may seem a little bit abstract, we can take a look at 3 varieties that really form a continuum here in this model, which are Hong Kong English, Indian English, and Singapore English, which really form a neat continuum here. So here, in terms of sociolinguistic profile, what can we say about these 3 varieties? It's always good to know what the other languages are, and say first languages are in each of the territories. So in Hong Kong, the first language is mainly Cantonese Chinese, and there is typically one main language, right? In India, okay, sure, there is Hindi, but there are also really a wide range of other first languages speakers. And in Singapore, there are 3 languages, which are Mandarin Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. And in terms of the functions, so that English has in these territories, in Hong Kong, and this is mostly because there is, or at least in part because there is a shared first language, the use in the public sphere is actually relatively limited, and the use in the private sphere is quite rare. In India, you have a bit of an in-between situation. It is English widely used in the public sphere, and that's partly a side effect of, well, having people from different first language backgrounds, right? And so it's rarely used in the private sphere. And in Singapore is an example where, also due to linguistic policies, it is very widely used in the public sphere. Everyone goes for an education in English, and is now also increasingly used in the private sphere. It is a bit on the way to becoming a first language. In terms of identity, well, that also means that in Singapore, it's a much stronger identity carrier than in Hong Kong, with India being in between. And in terms of norm orientation, well, here too, in Singapore, there is a strong endonormative attitude. So they essentially turn to a local norm, whereas in Hong Kong, actually, questionnaires and surveys have shown that they still tend to turn more or consider a native norm as the standard, and India again being a bit in between. All right, so that gives you an overview of what that needs to be at different stages of the model. This comes with linguistic predictions, right? Then the question is, well, do these predictions actually hold in the face of empirical data, right? Are they confirmed? So that's basically, that means putting the dynamic model to the test of data. The question then being, do more advanced varieties in the model exhibit more novel linguistic inventions, and so do they pattern less like British English? So many studies have looked into that, at least in one way or another, and mostly using the ICE corpora, and we get really basically 2 different answers. Some have clearly shown that prediction to hold. For instance, phrasal verbs are some things where we find a lot of creativity in more advanced varieties and new phrasal verbs. Differences in terms of dissociations between verbs and constructions as well, that holds. But then some other studies find basically the exact opposite trend. So, which, at least intuitively here, or based on this model, would be quite unexpected. And these are studies that have, for instance, looked at the use of prepositions, at n-grams, so multi-word expressions, and the like. And so here, what has been noted, let's say, is that, well, maybe identity marking is not the only factor here. Maybe factors such as proficiency or exposure can sometimes outweigh norm orientation. And so here, I mean, that means that, well, it makes us think a little bit about the limitations of the dynamic model. And importantly, it's a model that actually only takes a social dynamic into account, that of identity formation to predict linguistic behavior. And it does not at all account for potentially different cognitive representations. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, more advanced varieties, sure, they have a stronger identity marking for English, but it also means more exposure to English. An acquisitional setting that then becomes closer to that of the first language. And then as a result, also a cognitive representation that becomes closer to that of a first language, right? So we have this, a social factor on the one hand, a cognitive one on the other. And so here, Hoffman, a few years back, has actually proposed that the dynamic model, I mean, clearly it is very useful, it shouldn't be thrown away, but could be meaningfully complemented by adding a cognitive constructionist perspective to it as well. So adding a cognitive twist, let's say, to the model. And so since we're here in a variationist conference, I'm not going to take for granted that everyone is entirely familiar with construction grammar. So here is a one slide crash course in construction grammar. So construction grammar theory of linguistics that posits that all linguistic units, lexis and grammar alike, are constructions, namely pairs of form and meaning. Okay, and these constructions form a continuum of abstraction. So you have very concrete, also called substantive constructions. For instance, if you take a word like cat, you have the form cat, which has the meaning of referring to a cat. You also have multi-word expressions like give me a break, okay, everything fully lexically specified. You have intermediate constructions, partly concrete and partly abstract constructions, like the Xer, the wire construction, then the more you study, the better grades you get, something like that, okay? Or give X to someone, something, a chance. And then at the upper hand, you have, you have the most abstract, so basically grammatical constructions. One example being the transitive construction, which has a verb, a direct object, and an indirect object. But remember, we're talking about form meaning pairs. Even though it looks entirely grammatical, it comes with the meaning of transfer. All right. And typically, speakers acquire, or what is theorized is that they acquire concrete constructions first and then generalize to get to the more abstract constructions. Okay. So note here, you still have this continuum of abstraction of the constructions, right? Concrete constructions, abstract constructions. And what Hoffman has done is that he has basically mapped that onto the 5 stages of the dynamic model, okay? Basically saying what? That in more advanced varieties, with more exposure, speakers have generalized more over the instances that they have included. And so they rely more on more abstract constructions. The reverse being true for less advanced varieties, who would rely more on more concrete constructions. What he then predicts is that, well, if you draw on more or rely on more abstract constructions, there will be more variability in the instantiations of the constructions and more productive constructions. Contrary, again, would be true for less advanced varieties. Here too, we have predictions. Now, does this hold in the face of empirical data? This is a somewhat more recent strand in the field, so there haven't been that many studies that have looked into this, but I'll give you some examples of some studies here. So one study carried out by Brunner and Hoffman, they looked at the way construction, as in you insinuate your way into the media, they are smiling their way to the bank, the boys worked, works, right? The boy works his way into the lives of a middle-class family, and so on. And so you note here, this is a construction that is known to show and to display quite a bit of variation here in the verb stops. And so what they did in this study is that they took all the varieties from Globi, so that's 19 varieties plus British English. And you here have the 5 stages in Schneider's model, and there aren't any varieties for the first stage, which have a number of varieties in the other stages. And what their results show, you have a plot. Basically, the higher up the line, the more productive the construction. And actually, at the bottom, it's probably not super clear, but the red line represents stage 2 varieties. The blue line, stage 5 varieties, and then the purple one is British English. And so here, quite clearly, the hypothesis is confirmed. The more advanced the variety, the more productive, and also more British-like the behavior. Similar results have been shown for other constructions that consider, and somewhat importantly here, lexical variation, right? Because that's basically what productivity is. Now, variability can be lexical, but it can also be formal, right? You can have a range of different formal instantiations. And so here I'll give the results of a case study that I conducted on the causative construction. So as in make someone laugh or cry and the like. And the verb start here can actually take different forms, and we can see how that plays out in different varieties of English. But this is a study conducted on the ICE Corpora again, and here actually only 4 varieties, so British English on the one hand, and then Singapore, Indian, and Hong Kong English on the other. Now, in the British data, you have find only 2 different forms. So make with an infinitive, as in say make someone think, or the passive counterpart, be made to think. So 2 different forms. By contrast, in the other 3 varieties, you actually get far more different formal patterns. So you have make someone think, or be made to think, but also make someone to think, or make someone thinks, or make someone thinking, and the like. So we see, at least in terms of form, clearly more variation in the new Englishes. There is a little bit more to it than that, because you have here at the bottom figures, which is called a relative entropy. It's basically a number that ranges between 0 and 1, and it tells you how much variability there is. Also meaning that it tells you how much speakers tend to rely on the range of structures, or perhaps only on a limited range of structures. And so here what we see is a very low relative entropy for British English. Singapore English has a actually relatively low, higher than British English, but lower relative entropy than India or Hong Kong. So we have a clear climb here, where we see more variability in Hong Kong English and in Indian English than in Singapore English. And so here this basically goes in the somewhat opposite direction of what is predicted, in the sense that the more advanced the variety, the less formal variation we find, but actually the more British-like, because Singapore English shows less variation than others, but is in that respect also closer to the British behavior here. So this is actually not at all incompatible with the cognitive approach. It makes sense, it's just not really modeled into the predictions, because what this seems to suggest and show is that, well, speakers of less advanced varieties, they may have some abstract construction, but that is somewhat less entrenched. And so you have potentially more variation that can occur because of this more unstable, say, convention to give rise to new instantiation patterns. The take-home message here being that, well, perhaps this model can be refined even further by integrating these kinds of predictions in cognitive model as well. All right, so this leads me to my conclusion here. So what we have seen here is that by taking a cognitive approach on top of the social one, we actually realize how much these two are really inextricably linked, but actually pull varieties in two somewhat opposite different directions. So the social force has to do with identity marking and pulls, in a sense, varieties away from, let's say, the mother variety of British English, right? But then the cognitive force has to do with the cognitive representation of the language. And here, well, more advanced varieties have representations, or speakers have representations, because that's not, but that align more closely with that of native speakers, right? And so here, this is a bit of recall to say that we need both to best account for observed linguistic behavior. And this is also a direction that I think the field is taking. I hope all this was clear. Thank you very much for your attention.